Captain Missy Ditchburn serves as a child protection advocate and divisional children's secretary for the Salvation Army in New Zealand. Now, this is important because she believes that her faith requires a commitment to see that no one gets left behind or forgotten. Missy currently sits on both the environmental sustainability and gender equity committees for the Salvation Army's New Zealand territory. Now, she will share more about her active work with as an advocate for the rights of women and children by promoting the intersection of climate justice, gender equality, and organizational accountability to ethic practices. So grateful for your presence and as you empower the next generation to lead in social justice work in the church. Your work is so critical, and we are also very blessed to be able to have you share with us in worship this morning. So again, we are grateful for you, Captain Missy Ditchburn. Let us hear from you.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Greetings to you all from New Zealand. It's in the morning over here, but good afternoon to you. I am feeling so inspired already. I could listen to everyone talk all day. So wow, what a privilege for me. A little bit about myself. From the age of 10, I was raised by a single mother with 2 younger sisters. I attended a church with a female pastor. I had witnessed female prime ministers in my own country, and all of my favorite school teachers were women. So as a young child, I felt surrounded by strong, independent ladies, and the idea to me as a young person that some people might see women differently was just silly. I couldn't think of any other word for it. One of my first experience of the reality of this other view of women sadly happened when I visited another church with my grandparents. My grandparents who are very supportive, by the way, of who I am today. But there was a part in the service where the male pastor got up onto the platform and invited anyone to pray. And I was used to being seen and heard in my own congregation as a young person, and I was excited for this opportunity to speak to God in this faith community. It became apparent very quickly that the only people praying out loud were men. And I still remember that feeling of being silenced, of experiencing silenceness for the first time outside of a home context. I knew that I had a voice, but all of a sudden it didn't feel safe to use it. And so as a child, I had these 2 young life experiences that have really shaped my view on gender equality. And the first was actually to do with a film that I saw when I was very young. And it was called Lilo and Stitch. And it's about this crazy alien who everyone thinks is so weird. And the alien has this one little friend who is a girl from Hawaii named Lilo. And towards the end of the film, the alien gets lost. And Lilo says, Ohana means family, and family means no one gets left behind or forgotten. And I can only describe that as a spiritual experience. It was as if the words came not from outside inside, but from the inside out. And for me as a person of faith, the only way I can reconcile this idea is that something about who God is, he shared with me and told me that that was going to be important in my life. My second experience was a little more sobering. I was a young person at a camp and I saw a poster on a wall that had a fair trade mark. I asked one of the leaders what this mark meant, and they explained to me that everything I owned and consumed was made by someone, and that for many of these people, many of them women and young girls, these jobs were not optional and they were not being treated fairly. And I was faced for the first time with a very uncomfortable truth that I could be both an advocate for freedom and a perpetrator of oppression at the same time. I believe that we are called to face our uncomfortable truths as individuals, as communities, and within organizations. And this is where my advocacy in the Salvation Army begins. So the Salvation Army is an egalitarian movement. However, as we all know, it's easy to be something in principle and much harder in practice. So the Salvation Army advocates for women and girls all over the world, and it advocated for me in my time of need as a young person, but it doesn't excuse us from not looking our uncomfortable truths directly in the face. So Jesus in the scriptures talks about this idea of taking out the log in our own eye before looking at the speck in somebody else's. And although climate justice and gender equality and violence against women, these are not specks. These are one of the most heartbreaking realities of our fallen world. But the truth remains that we must never lose sight of the ways in which we may be the oppressor of the very people we are trying to walk alongside in their freedom. We must address how we contribute to climate change and therefore the vulnerability of women. We must address where we buy our resources and ask who made them, and how do we not meet the standards that we profess externally in our internal organisation. So I believe that all women are created to thrive, that this is God's intention for all of creation, not just for people. And so when I think of gender equity, I think of a ladder, and I use the word equity intentionally because if we acknowledge that thriving is the goal, we know that men start on a higher step towards the top of the ladder. But one of the other truths we also acknowledge in gender equity is that not all women get to start on the same step of the ladder also. And we know that we are not free until we are all free. So it may be uncomfortable, but achieving gender equality for some women while leaving the rest to climb the ladder alone is not really an achievement. And if I choose to move up the ladder by myself, it is nothing more than selfish ambition rather than the pursuit of justice. And this is not the way of Jesus. He gave up his power to lift others up. And so the question that I continually have to ask myself and that I advocate for in my organization is, how do we climb this ladder together? Who is not in the room, and who are the decisions we are making really going to impact? And when it comes to gender equality and gender equity, we're also asking, what are the barriers to women reaching that next step? And to do this, I like to take a bigger view, go bigger, by starting smaller. And that's by remembering that every person experiencing or perpetuating injustice was once a child. So in my work in child protection, we talk about the theory of cumulative harm, that every child experiences a number of risk factors and protective factors that increase or decrease their ability or opportunities to thrive. They have to work much harder for the same things. And these risk factors, when they gather together, when there are more, it makes it more challenging for a young person to thrive on their journey. New Zealand has the highest rate of intimate partner violence against women in the OECD. Over COVID, we saw this number increase in seriousness of the reporting, but also with many organisations experiencing double the amount of calls for help for women experiencing violence. Some of the biggest victims of violence, though, are the smallest. An organisation in New Zealand, Plunkett, states that children who have a parent who is or was abused have a higher risk of being abused themselves. Even if the abuser is not directly violent to the children, children may be seriously affected by seeing or hearing their parents being hurt. Brain development is affected by good experiences, but equally by poor quality experiences. And children who experience violence can experience developmental delays, struggles with mental health, and increase the likelihood of becoming an abuser. UNICEF reports, heartbreakingly, that the single best predictor of children becoming either perpetrators or victims, survivors of domestic violence later in life is whether or not they grow up in a home where there is violence. So although some of my earliest experiences included witnessing domestic violence for myself, I had a number of other protective factors purely afforded by privilege that aided me in my journey. And the uncomfortable truth is that I started further up the ladder, but many children like me, through no fault of their own and through no fault of their parents, are still left behind. And these are very real examples of how gender equity and climate justice intersect, as we see how changes in temperature, changes economies, changes opportunities, and traps people in generational harm. So we must continue to reach the furthest behind first, to advocate for organisations to take all women with them on their journey, and acknowledge that there are barriers that are in the way for women to thrive in the life that God has for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Missy, so much. I mean, you all are just amazing. And of course, like the other panelists, you said so much. And then we'll get to Q&A at the end, but just a few things I wanted to bring up. Well, first of all, let me thank you for your transparency and your vulnerability to share your story as well. Because what I thought about as you told the story about how, when you started telling your story, I thought about, yes, we're called to be justice seekers and truth tellers, right? And I think you're challenging us. Truth telling is not just about what's happening out there, but what's happening within. So I like the fact you're challenging us, even in the work that we do, that we also have to take our inner look and attend to, as Howard Thurman would say, our inner sanctuary, right? We have to make sure, unless we become, that which we are fighting against if we're not careful. So thank you for that. And I like the ways in which you do this anchored in your faith, right? This whole idea that faith and public life intersect. So I'm curious, because people often ask me this question when I'm out doing a lot of this work is, what anchors you? Is there a particular scripture that you use, right, that centers you and grounds you for this work?
Yeah, there's a couple. One of them is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And when I learned that the word in the Bible for righteousness and justice are the same word, that really just had a huge impact on my life. The idea that actually Jesus is the perfect picture of God's righteousness, the righteousness that we fall short of. How amazing is it that in pursuing justice and seeking justice, that we actually participate in the righteousness of God? And so I'm really inspired by that. And obviously, Micah, what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. And humility and learning to embrace humility has been a big part of my journey.
Thank you. And I'm gonna ask you again, Reverend Deanna. I know we're tracking with time. One question, time for one more for Missy. So one more. Okay. So one of the things that you mentioned in your sharing your narrative, your story, was that you really saw women in positions of power, right? In particularly in the church. So it really underscores that representation really matters, right? And we've said, previous panels have mentioned that women, right? Women and girls are the ones who are on the forefront of all of this change. So I'm curious to know, in your work with the Salvation Army, what are some specific programs, initiatives, or ways that you make sure that women are in positions of power so that the next generation of young girls can see, this representation to carry this work out for generations to come?
Yeah, so internally, the Salvation Army has just finished in New Zealand its gender equity principle document, and that includes a quota of 50% for women on all senior management and boards. So that is significant for us in ensuring that women take the place that is rightfully theirs, and that young girls coming up through the Salvation Army or wanting to work for the Salvation Army or be part of the faith community see women at every level of the organization, and that women's voices are heard on every board. Internationally as well, obviously we have a lot of programs around education for women, schools and hospitals, and those places always ensure that they have women employed, working for them, again, so that children can see women represented in those places. We're also doing a lot of work in schools with young people, like youth programs, to help engage young girls, to empower them, to help their voice be heard. So those are probably some of the ways I can think of. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dion.
Thank you so much, Rev. And Captain Missy, you again have inspired us. I mean, truly, this is the part when you said, I knew I had a voice, but all of a sudden didn't feel safe to use it. That is so many of our experiences. But again, as a girl on fire, you pushed through that, and so grateful. You mentioned about being an advocate for freedom and at the same time recognizing being a perpetrator of oppression. These are things that you mentioned, of course, and also at the UN Women motto and their intervention and imploring us to leave no one behind. You do the same thing in your work, as well as echoing some of the champions for Reverend Ayers and ours, Fannie Lou Hamer saying the same thing. Nobody's free until all are free. You know, so you said the same thing, and the go bigger by staying smaller. Oh my goodness, we're putting together a list of all of the quotes from all of you on this panel so far. Such a really great gift. We're so grateful that your faith inspires you to do the work that you're doing. Thank you.